They called him the Young Wolf, but it was Lord Eddard Stark's gaze that truly set the tone in the torchlit tent. Gray eyes, filled with both deep sadness and unwavering resolve, regarded Ser Jaime Lannister warily. Robb Stark stood beside his father, a slight tension in his jaw that betrayed his own uncertainty. Their journey to this moment had been paved with blood, betrayal, and the echoes of ravens bearing ill tidings. Yet here they were, forced into a rare accord by circumstance and by a choice that would ripple across the Seven Kingdoms. Ned Stark lived worn, heartsore from his harrowing captivity in King's Landing, but alive. He was only standing here because of a tenuous negotiation that had allowed him to leave the capital under conditions that he would never again take up arms against the crown. But the war that had erupted after his arrest did not simply vanish, and the Riverlands still burned. Now Jaime Lannister, the fabled Kingslayer who had once served in the Kingsguard, knelt before them, his pride hidden behind eyes still sharp with a swordsman's confidence. A hush lay thick in the tent, broken only by the distant thunder of men stirring in the encampment and the restless whinny of horses. Northern lords pressed close, wanting to hear every word. Several had swords half drawn in silent threat. The tension was a living force, coiling around every man present. Jaime looked at Ned with a curious mixture of respect and resentment. This was the same man who had condemned his king-slaying act years ago, long before the War of the Five Kings had even been imagined. And it was Robb, that young upstart who had bested him in battle, who now held him in captivity. That alone was a blow to his pride, but Jaime Lannister had learned harsh lessons while bound by chains. Robb's voice was cool but resolute when he spoke. "We have discussed this, my lords. My father and I have weighed the consequences. A time may come to regret this decision, but for now we see the value in a different path." His blue eyes surveyed the assembly. "Ser Jaime Lannister has agreed, under oath, to pledge himself to our cause, provided we allow him the chance to redeem himself and his house. If we turn him away or simply execute him, more blood will be spilled, blood that the North cannot afford to lose." Murmurs spread through the tent. Great John Umber, always boisterous, clenched a meaty fist around the hilt of his blade and spat in the straw. "A Lannister cannot be trusted," he thundered. "We be fools to let a lion roam among wolves." Ned raised a hand for silence, and though his voice was soft, everyone listened. "I understand your anger. I share in it in many ways. But Ser Jaime has given certain assurances. We must consider what might come of an alliance, however fragile, that spares the lives of our men and the small folk." He turned those steady gray eyes on Jaime. "Should you betray our trust, I will stand by my son's verdict. You will die." Jaime inclined his head, a hint of ironic amusement dancing in the corners of his mouth. "I would expect no less from you, Lord Stark." In the corner, Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, laid his huge head on massive paws, amber eyes ever watchful. The beast seemed unconvinced, as though he could sense the roiling tension in his master's heart. Yet for now, he stayed silent, a spectral presence that lent an otherworldly weight to the gathering. Edmure Tully, red hair aflame in the lamplight, added his own misgiving. "You ask us to work with a man who has spilled our family's blood. Remember the ambush at Riverrun, the torment my people suffered." Jaime's eyes flickered. Guilt? Perhaps something akin to it. Yet he did not flinch from the reminder. He bowed his head, but there was still steel in him. "I have done what war demands of soldiers, my lord, and I have my share of regrets. If you grant me this chance, I will attempt to make amends, though I know it will never truly restore what was lost." The silence that followed was like a held breath. Ned studied Jaime carefully, recalling that fateful day at the Red Keep, how he had found the Kingslayer slouched on the Iron Throne, the Mad King's blood still wet on the golden scales of his armor. Ever since, Ned had distrusted this man. Yet the realm had changed, and sometimes the only way to endure was to forge uneasy alliances. Robb placed a hand on the pommel of his sword. "If there are no further objections, I will accept Ser Jaime's oath now, under the old gods, and before the men here gathered." When no one spoke, the Great John begrudgingly nodded, though his glower remained. Others followed suit in reluctant agreement, if only because the king in the north and Lord Stark demanded it. Still, the atmosphere was thick with skepticism. Jaime slid down to one knee, pressing a hand over his heart. Without ceremony, in words that would be remembered long after, he pledged his sword and service to House Stark, to the protection of the Riverlands, and above all, to the idea that peace could be won without the total destruction of House Lannister. It was an oath that made many in the tent bristle. Yet as those words echoed, the flap of the tent stirred, admitting a gust of cold wind. To some, it felt like a sign that the old gods were listening. To others, it was merely the world shifting in a way no one had quite expected. They left the tent to the sight of dawn creeping over the spires of the makeshift camp. Ned breathed in the chill air, his bruised ribs protesting with each intake. He still carried scars from his imprisonment, both seen and unseen. Yet the northern wind gave him a hint of strength. He glanced at Robb, who was no longer the boy who had once cried the day he cut himself practicing with a wooden sword. War had hardened him, perhaps too quickly. Jaime walked a short distance behind them, flanked by Stark guards, his new vow only moments old. Around them, the men of the North watched with open suspicion. For all his regal bearing, for all the talk of honor and redemption, Jaime Lannister was still the man who had nearly cleaved Robb's forces apart at the Whispering Wood and who had dared to cross swords with men like the great Jon and Roose Bolton. Though few would openly defy King Robb's will, their eyes spoke volumes. At the edge of the clearing, Ned turned to Jaime. "You understand that we do not trust you," he said in a tone that was neither cruel nor kind. "This chance you've been given is precarious at best. One misstep, one instance of betrayal, and even if I wanted to save your life, I could not." Jaime nodded. "I have no illusions, Lord Stark. The North has every reason to wish me dead. But I see a path forward, if only barely." There was a flicker in his gaze, determination, perhaps, or a desire to prove something to himself. "I will do my part to ensure House Lannister is not remembered solely for its cruelties." Ned found that surprising. Jaime had always struck him as arrogant, more concerned with his own image than the fate of his house. Perhaps captivity had sown doubt in him, or maybe he truly had regrets that weighed on him like mail. The notion of Jaime's hidden depth left Ned uneasy. He had met too many cunning courtiers in King's Landing who hid behind friendly smiles. As they approached the rows of tents where the Stark host was rousing for the day's march, Robb cleared his throat. "We move at midday," he said, addressing Jaime. "Our next objective is to secure Harrenhal before the Lannister forces can regroup. My uncle Brynden has scouted the roads. You will ride with us under guard, but I may call upon your knowledge of the land and your insight into your father's strategies." A sardonic smile curved Jaime's lips. "Tywin Lannister is methodical. He will try to draw you into open battle on ground of his choosing. If you want Harrenhal, you may well get it, but you risk being pinned between my father's men and the Freys if they decide to play both sides." At the mention of the Freys, Robb's face hardened. "That bridge troll Walder Frey has sworn allegiance, but I have no illusions about his loyalty. He does only what suits him. For now, we must rely on the alliance we have." They walked on in silence, passing men lacing their boots, sharpening swords, extinguishing campfires. Direwolves were not the only beasts in this camp. Here and there, newly arrived bannermen from the mountainous clans of the Vale, sent by Lady Lisa Arryn on Ned's request, tended their own ragged tents. The River Lords, ragged from too many battles, tried to find pride in continuing the fight, while the Lords of the North had a stoicism that matched the cold morning. Ned halted in front of a grander tent lined with Stark banners. He placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "Son, see to the men. Make sure Jaime is given a place to sleep in chains for now, but not too many. Enough to show we trust his vow just enough." There was a faint upturn of his lip. "I'll speak with you before we depart." Robb nodded, shooting Jaime a quick glance. "You heard him, Lannister. Stay near. My father and I will decide how best to use your counsel. In the meantime, keep your sword sheathed unless commanded otherwise." Jaime bowed his head with an odd sort of courtesy, then turned and followed two guards who led him away. The tension in the air lingered. Once Jaime was out of earshot, Ned exhaled. "I hope we are not making a grave mistake." "We may be," Robb admitted. "But if there is a way to keep the men alive and perhaps avoid a protracted slaughter, we have to try. We've seen what the mountain's brigands did to the Riverlands. If Jaime's presence can prevent more tragedies, let us pray to the gods it does," Ned finished. He parted ways with Robb and ducked into the tent, ignoring the aching in his bones. Inside, Catelyn Stark stood by a small table, her hands folded. Her eyes flickered with relief at the sight of him, then with concern. "I saw Jaime Lannister leave under guard," she said, voice subdued. "He's truly to fight beside us?" "It seems so," Ned replied. "If you can call it fighting beside when every man here wants him dead." But Robb and I agreed that this might be the only way to spare lives. We need a chance at something resembling peace, or at least a shorter war. Catelyn pressed her lips thin, but there was no anger in her gaze. Only fear. I trust you both. I only hope the cost of this does not come back to haunt us. The Lannisters are cunning." She gestured for Ned to sit. He sank onto a wooden stool, easing his weight off his wounded leg. She knelt to check the bandages on his calf. "Your wounds have reopened. You should rest instead of marching. Let Robb command the host." But Ned shook his head. "I'll rest when the war is done, Cat. As long as my son is out there risking his life, I will stand with him. I cannot hide behind tents and Maester's potions." He paused, the old guilt rearing its head when he thought of the girls Sansa and Arya still in King's Landing under the shadow of the Iron Throne. Perhaps they were safer now that a fragile truce existed, but he could not banish his worry. "Any word from the capital?" A soft sigh left Catelyn's lips. "Only scattered news. Sansa wrote of how the Queen Regent keeps her close, but we have little idea of Arya's whereabouts. She's said to be alive, but who truly knows?" Ned swallowed back his frustration. They should have released the girls by now if the crown claims to want peace. But perhaps that is something we can press Jaime for. He might still have enough influence to ensure their safety. Catelyn rose and touched Ned's shoulder. "Be careful, my love. Even a golden sword can stab in the back." He nodded. "I know, but we must try." That day passed in a flurry of preparations. Horses were saddled, wagons loaded, and scouts rode out. The battered Tully forces, combined with the northern host, formed a procession of thousands as they began their march. At the head, Robb rode a majestic warhorse, gray wind loping at his side, and behind him came the great Jon Roose Bolton and the other northern lords. The river lords, led by Edmure Tully, followed, carrying banners that dripped red with the memory of lost battles. And somewhere in the middle, under constant watch, rode Jaime Lannister, bearing no sigil on his cloak. Not a single man greeted Jaime with kindness, though some looked on him with cold curiosity. The so-called Kingslayer in northern ranks was a symbol both of possible peace and uneasy betrayal. Ned rode beside his son for a time, conferring in hushed tones about possible routes and what news their spies had gleaned about Tywin's movements. The war had not ground to a halt simply because one Lannister had changed sides. Armies still prowled the land like hungry wolves, and Tywin Lannister was not a man to let his son's capture, let alone his defection, go unanswered. Ned kept a wary eye on every ridge and every tree line, anticipating an ambush. But day turned into dusk without incident. They made camp near a bend in the river, the ruins of an old watchtower looming over them. Sentinels were posted, patrols organized. As the sky bruised into twilight, campfires sprang to life, and the army settled into cautious rest. Ned found himself at a small fire with Robb, Catelyn, and a few trusted officers. Not far away, Jaime sat with his guards. He looked strangely lonesome, gold hair gleaming in the firelight as he poked half-heartedly at his dinner. "He doesn't look like a man who relishes betrayal," Catelyn murmured. "Or perhaps he simply misses his luxuries," Robb quipped with a hint of bitterness. Ned watched the nights pass around flasks of ale, men too exhausted to care about the day's strangeness. "It won't be easy for him," Ned said quietly. He turned his back on his father, his sister, even his own name in some ways, if he's truly honest in his oath. "We must keep that in mind, for it might breed resentment." Robb nodded, though his gaze lingered on Jaime. "I'll have men watch him day and night." Later, when the fire had burned down to embers, Ned rose and brushed dirt from his clothes. He felt each ache as if it had a name, each bruise a memory of the dungeons in King's Landing. He longed to close his eyes and forget everything for a few hours, but duty called. He walked to where Jaime's guards had pitched a small tent. The two soldiers stepped aside at his approach, though they gave him questioning glances. Jaime, on seeing Ned, stirred from a restless half-sleep. He propped himself up on an elbow, the chain around his ankle rattling. Ned stared at him for a long moment, remembering how this man had knelt in the throne room over the Mad King's corpse. Then, with a sigh, he crouched by the entrance. "We have not always seen eye to eye. To be honest, we likely never will. But I need you to understand something. If your father comes at us with steel, we will fight back. Your presence here will not change that." Jaime nodded. "I know. I also know that Tywin Lannister is not one to show mercy unless it suits him. But if you give me the chance, I may be able to parley with him or at least help you anticipate his next move." Ned's face remained impassive. If it comes to parley, you'll be the first to know. Good night, Sir Jaime. He rose and departed, leaving the Kingslayer alone with his thoughts and perhaps the first twinges of a conscience stirring in the night. By dawn on the next day, clouds crowded the sky in a dense gray canopy. The force marched onward, keeping the winding river on their right. Harrenhal lay ahead, a brooding ruin of blackened towers and sprawling courtyards. Word had reached them that Lord Roose Bolton had temporarily claimed it in Robb's name, but the hold on such a cursed fortress was tenuous. The place had a way of devouring garrisons, swallowing armies, and spitting out misery. Still, it held strategic value, a seat from which to oversee much of the Riverlands. As the northern host neared the towering silhouette of Harrenhal, Jaime noticed the sea of camps spread along the outer walls. Tents bearing the flayed man of House Bolton mingled with those sporting the shroud of House Tully. Great black ravens circled overhead, cawing like omens. The drawbridge was lowered and sentries waved them through. Beyond the gates, the courtyard was littered with remnants of past sieges, broken catapults, half-burnt wagons, the bleached bones of horses. Roose Bolton, pale and inscrutable, greeted Robb and Ned in the courtyard. His eyes flicked over Jaime with a detached curiosity, as though evaluating a new species of bug. A surprising addition to your ranks, my lord, he murmured to Robb. I trust you have him on a short leash? Robb's jaw tightened. He rides under guard. We've an arrangement, Lord Bolton. Bolton offered a thin smile. Of course. His gaze drifted to Ned, then back to Robb. We've maintained a watch on the roads south. There have been skirmishes, but the Lannister host has not yet encroached. My men have taken a few prisoners, nothing substantial, mostly sellswords. No sign of Lord Tywin's main force. Ned surveyed the courtyard, the weight of leadership pressing on him. How do the men fare? Wearied, Roose Bolton said with a shrug. But they endure. Then, with a cold glint in his eyes, he added, they'll no doubt find renewed vigor if a battle is at hand. Jaime stood off to the side, arms folded, saying little. He scanned the pitted walls of Harrenhal, the monstrous towers that had melted under dragonfire centuries ago. He could feel the chill of the fortress's history, a sense that even the bravest knights might tremble within these halls. Once, Housewind had held this castle. Then came war, shift in allegiances, and the unstoppable might of Tywin Lannister's war machine. Now, ironically, Jaime stepped through these halls not as a conqueror, but as a strange ally of the North. Within the great hall, they gathered around a long oaken table. Maps lay strewn across its surface, corners weighted down by daggers. Sconces burned on the walls, casting flickering shadows. The lords assembled, Roose Bolton, Edmure Tully, the Great John, Midge Mormont, and others of note. Robb and Ned took the central positions while Jaime was permitted a seat near the edge, still guarded though the chains had been removed from his ankles for the meeting. Edmure Tully traced a line on the map with his forefinger. We have small pockets of loyal riverlords here, here, and here. The Lannisters still harry them, but Tywin has pulled many of his forces back west, likely to protect Lannisport and Casterly Rock. Reports suggest King's Landing remains under the control of the Queen Regent and the boy King Joffrey. Robb looked at Jaime. How do you think your father will respond if we push further west? Will he rush east to shield King's Landing or fortify his own seat? Jaime answered after a moment's thought, eyes on the map. Tywin will not abandon his seat. But he's not blind to the value of King's Landing. My sister sits on the throne as regent and he won't leave her defenseless. He'll attempt to split his forces, covering both the west and the capital. But that may stretch him thin, an advantage for you if you strike quickly. Roose Bolton's lips quirked. And why should we rely on the Kingslayer's insights? Ned's voice was subdued but firm. Because his knowledge of Tywin's strategies could tip the balance. But we remain cautious. Jaime ignored Bolton's barb and continued. If you aim to broker peace, striking west and taking the rock would be a powerful negotiation tool. But it's no small undertaking. Casterly Rock is near impregnable. The approach is guarded by steep cliffs and the mines beneath are labyrinthine. The Great John let out a rumbling chuckle. I'd like to see the look on Tywin's face when a pack of northerners batters down his gates. Bolton's quiet voice cut through. You speak of negotiation, yet a siege on the rock is an act of aggression. How do you reconcile that? A flicker of irritation crossed Robb's features. Negotiation is only viable if both sides come to the table as equals. Right now, Tywin believes we are rebels who must be crushed. But if we prove we can strike at the heart of Lannister power, it might force him to speak terms. Ned glanced at Jaime. We also want the safe return of my daughters from King's Landing. That will be part of any negotiation. Jaime's expression hardened. I understand. He hesitated a moment, meeting Ned's gaze squarely. For what it's worth, I will do all I can to secure their release. Silence claimed the hall. It was a delicate moment, this uneasy collaboration. None among the northern lords truly trusted Jaime, yet the hope of ending the war tugged at them like a siren call. More bloodshed loomed on the horizon if they did not act decisively. Robb circled a spot on the map near Harrenhal. We'll need to gather more men before any western campaign. We hold the advantage here. Harrenhal is a central location. We can call our banners, fortify, and perhaps lure Tywin's forces into disadvantageous ground. And if that fails, we push west quickly. The plan, though still half-formed, began to coalesce. They discussed logistics, the supply routes, the state of the roads, the necessity of bridging alliances with uneasy neighbors like Walder Frey. They talked through best-case scenarios, coordinated attacks, forced negotiations, and worst-case outcomes, including betrayal from within or a pincer movement by the Lannister forces that could decimate them. Eventually, the meeting concluded and the lords dispersed. Some went to inspect the garrison, others to see to the wounded. Ned lingered behind, resting heavily on the table as he closed his eyes against a wave of weariness. The demands of the day weighed heavily, but he forced himself upright when he sensed Jaime still present. Jaime's expression was subdued. I know we're not friends, Lord Stark, but I want you to know, if I hadn't come to see the madness in King's Landing, I'd still be a prisoner in your camp or a corpse. Whatever my reasons, I'm here now. I hope my being here can help save your daughters. Ned's voice was quiet, contained. I will never forget that you were the one who killed King Aerys. Some call you King Lear. I judged you for that once without knowing the full story. But these are different times and I must judge you by your actions now. Time will tell if we made the right decision in allowing you to join us. Jaime inclined his head and left, leaving Ned alone in the echoing silence of Harrenhal's great hall. Above, the vaulted ceiling loomed like the ribcage of some ancient beast. Ned rubbed his temple, thinking of the responsibilities that weighed on him, the survival of the North, the Riverlands, his beloved daughters, and the fragile future they might salvage from the chaos. Harrenhal might be cursed, but for now it was their stronghold. War still simmered in every corner of the realm, and Ned Stark suspected that the next move could come from anywhere, Tywin Lannister, Renly, or Stannis Baratheon in the south. Or even from the Iron Islands if Balon Greyjoy was emboldened by the realm's upheaval. There was too much to consider. Yet for the moment, the king in the north, his father, and their reluctant Lannister ally would have to hold this ground. It was an alliance forged in necessity, battered by distrust, but bound by the faint possibility that the realm could avoid sinking further into a bloodbath. Over the following days, a strange rhythm settled into Harrenhal. Scouts came and went, bearing tidings of troop movements and uneasy tidings from King's Landing. Runners returned from the north with news that some houses were slow to answer the call, their resources strained by the prolonged conflict. Still, the bulk of Stark bannermen were en route, spurred on by the knowledge that their king in the north needed them to push back the Lannisters or force a settlement. Within the fortress, the newly arrived soldiers spread out in the once grande dining halls and drafty corridors. Harrenhal, massive as it was, had more than enough space to house them, though a pervasive gloom clung to every stone. The old gods did not live here, no weirwood grew within these blackened walls. Men whispered of ghosts and curses. In corners, they swore they heard the distant clang of phantom hammers, a relic of the castle's doomed construction under King Harren the Black. But rumors and dread were nothing new to an army hardened by war. Jaime Lannister found himself an object of curiosity and scorn. Northern men spat near his boots when he passed or muttered oaths under their breath. The River Lords, especially those who had suffered at the hands of Lannister raids, had no kindness for him. And the Bolton men watched him with unsettling, pale-eyed intensity as though wondering if they should flay him in his sleep. Yet Jaime pressed on, maintaining a guarded politeness. He would eat with the guards, run drills in the yard, always under watchful eyes, and occasionally find himself summoned to council by Robb, Ned, or Edmure Tully. It was there, in those small gatherings around maps and letters, that Jaime truly began to grasp the tightrope he now walked. He offered insights into Tywin's mindset. He recalled the standard formations, the supply lines, and the alliances House Lannister had nurtured. Each piece of information was given with a certain reluctance. This was his family, after all, but he did not hold back. He had pledged his help, and so he helped. In exchange, a tenuous respect began to form, at least from some quarters. Great John Umber remained openly hostile, but even he could not deny the advantage that Jaime's knowledge provided. Roose Bolton merely observed, occasionally pressing Jaime with pointed questions about troop strength and infiltration tactics. Meanwhile, Edmure Tully put aside his hatred enough to glean every scrap of advantage he could, driven by the fierce need to protect his homeland. Robb Stark, for his part, maintained a stoic distance. Though he consulted Jaime, he never spoke to him as a friend. Only once, when they were alone in a corridor, did Robb's composure crack. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing," Robb muttered, glancing at Jaime with a troubled scowl. "We've all lost so much. My father was nearly killed. My sisters are still hostages. And now I'm here, listening to a Lannister." Jaime's mouth twitched into a bitter smirk. "We all make choices we never imagined. Believe me, I never saw myself bending the knee to House Stark." Robb's eyes flashed with something akin to sorrow. "We do what we must for our people. Let's hope it's enough." When not consulting or marching, Jaime took to practicing in the yard. He clashed swords with grizzled veterans who wanted to test the Kingslayer's reputed skill. Despite his captivity, Jaime's prowess was undeniable. He bested challengers with swift, efficient strikes, though never with a showy flourish. It was as if humility had tempered his once cocky style. Yet for every victory he saw only stony faces. No cheers, no camaraderie, just the stark acknowledgement that he remained their foe, tolerated only for the knowledge he offered. Ned Stark observed one of these bouts from a balcony above the yard. His limbs still ached, and a slight limp remained. Next to him stood Catelyn, arms folded. They watched as Jaime disarmed a burly soldier, sending the man's sword clattering to the dirt. Jaime lowered his blade, stepping back without a trace of smugness. "He's good," Catelyn commented grudgingly. Ned nodded. "He's one of the finest swordsmen in the Seven Kingdoms. Even if he were half as skilled, men would flock to see him fight. But here, we're all too weary for admiration." Catelyn's gaze grew distant. "I wonder how Sansa and Arya fare. If Jaime truly means to help us, he could be the key to freeing them." Ned leaned on the balcony's edge. He yearned for his daughters, a constant ache in his heart. "Aye, that's what we must hold on to. If we can close this war swiftly, perhaps we can bring them home." That evening, Ned found Jaime in one of Harrenhal's lesser halls, alone at a rough-hewn table, poring over an old set of ledgers. The hall was dimly lit by a single lantern, walls festooned with ancient tapestries that had survived dragonfire and centuries of neglect. Jaime glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Lord Stark." Ned hesitated, then stepped forward. "I didn't expect to find you here." Jaime tapped the ledger's brittle pages. "I was tracing old logistics from when my father first took Harrenhal, trying to recall supply routes, potential weaknesses. Thought it might be useful to see how the castle was managed under House Lannister's influence." Ned considered him carefully. "And what have you found?" Jaime gave a one-shouldered shrug. "That my father is meticulous. He documented every shipment of grain, every armament stored. I suspect he's done the same for Casterly Rock. If you want to lay siege or negotiate, you need to know what you're up against." Ned joined him at the table, a subtle sign of trust. "You've done more than I expected, offering up these details. I was prepared for half-truths." A flicker of wry amusement crossed Jaime's face. "I owe you, Stark. You and Robb could have executed me for my sins, real or perceived. If there's a chance to salvage the realm or free your daughters, I'll lend my sword to it." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled through Harrenhal's towers. At length, Ned spoke, voice tinged with reluctance. "I judged you harshly for slaying the Mad King, but perhaps there was more to it than I knew." Jaime's gaze grew distant. "There was, but I doubt you want the tale." Ned said nothing. In the hush, Jaime exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Aerys Targaryen was mad. He intended to burn King's Landing, every man, woman, and child in it. He had wildfire caches hidden throughout the city, and his pyromancers were ready. When your father and brother were killed and Robert Baratheon led his rebellion, Aerys grew desperate. He ordered me to bring him my father's head, and he told his pyromancer to set the fires if the city fell. I killed him to stop that, but I never told the full truth. No one wanted to hear it. They needed a villain, a Kingslayer, to make the story tidy." Ned listened, recalling how he'd entered the throne room that day to find Jaime on the Iron Throne. He'd made assumptions. Perhaps it was simpler to see Jaime as an arrogant oathbreaker than to acknowledge the complicated truth. "It seems many stories are simpler than the reality," Ned murmured. Jaime's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're a man of honor, Stark. I know what you must have thought of me, but I'll live with it. I've had to." Nodding slowly, Ned stood. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can shape the future. Come, show me what you've gleaned from these ledgers about Harrenhal's supply routes. We'll see how we can use that to our advantage." Together, they bent over the ancient pages, discussing the fortress's vulnerability to siege from the north side, the best vantage points for archers, and how to keep the fortress provisioned in a protracted conflict. In that moment, two men once locked in animosity forged an unlikely collaboration, driven by war, tempered by the fragility of hope. The days continued and the lines of conflict shifted as ravens arrived with new intelligence. Tywin's forces remained in the west, shoring up defenses around the Gold Road. Word came that the Tyrells had fully declared for King Renly, who now marched from Highgarden toward King's Landing. Renly's host was large, well-provisioned, and might soon threaten the capital. If Joffrey was toppled, the Lannisters might be forced into a desperate defense. In a cramped war council, Jaime evaluated the news with a keen eye. If Renly takes King's Landing, my sister and Joffrey will be at his mercy. Tywin cannot ignore that. He'll be forced to pull men from the west, exposing Casterly Rock. Robb drummed his fingers on the table. Good. It draws him thinner. But Ned shook his head. We must think carefully. If Joffrey falls, what does that do for Sansa and Arya? We need them safely out of the city. The Tyrells might treat them as bargaining chips just as readily as the Lannisters have. Jaime agreed. The Tyrells will make their own claims. They might crown Renly or press for alliances. The girls' fate will be uncertain. If we want them, we need a direct negotiation or a decisive blow. Waiting for Renly to do the job might complicate everything. They decided to wait a little longer to gather more men at Harrenhal and strengthen their hold on the Riverlands. The castle groaned under the presence of so many soldiers, but the cursed walls held. Each day, Ned walked the battlements, reflecting on how precarious it all felt, like standing on a thin ledge above a yawning chasm. So many enemies, so many uncertain allies. One moonlit evening, Ned stood by the main gate, looking out over the wide moat that shimmered under starlight. Robb joined him, the young king's face etched with lines that did not belong on a youth of his age. "Father," Robb began quietly, "I worry about the Freys. They haven't mustered half the men they promised. And I hear whispers they're in talks with Tywin." Ned clenched a fist on the cold stone parapet. "Walder Frey is a vulture. He'll play both sides until he sees a clear winner. We can't rely on him." Robb exhaled. "So it falls to us. If Tywin marches east, we must be ready. If Renly marches north, we must be prepared for whatever he offers or demands. And meanwhile, we cling to the hope that Jaime's vow is sincere." Ned squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "All we can do is be vigilant, gather our strength, and press forward. There's no safe path, Robb. Not anymore." And so Harrenhal became the crucible in which destinies were forged. Surrounded by the gloom of melted towers, the watchers on the ramparts scanned the horizon for the first glint of Lannister banners or the Tyrell rose. Below, in cramped halls, men sharpened swords, patched mail, nursed wounds, and tried to find warmth in the meager fires. The war had only paused for a moment. Soon, it would roar back to life with a fury that could consume them all. A fortnight passed in tense anticipation. The corridors of Harrenhal echoed with the footfalls of ever more arriving soldiers. Raventree Hall sent a contingent of bowmen, their quivers bristling with black-feathered arrows. From White Harbor came a modest force of knights clad in gleaming steel, sworn to House Manderley and determined to stand by the king in the north. Each day, newcomers would eye Jaime Lannister with open disdain, yet none openly challenged the decision to keep him among them. Ned and Robb worked tirelessly to coordinate their growing army, forging a unified command despite the diverse banners. The nights were filled with war councils lit by guttering candles, maps, and correspondences strewn about. The elder Stark's experience combined with Robb's keen instincts made for a formidable leadership duo. The northern lords might grumble at Jaime's presence, but they followed Robb's word as law. He was their king, after all. Amid these preparations, a raven arrived from the capital carrying a sealed letter. The wax bore the sigil of House Lannister, a golden lion. Ned read it first, brow furrowing at each line. Robb stood by impatient. Finally, Ned passed it over, his voice laced with caution. "It's from Tyrion Lannister." Robb's eyebrows rose. He read swiftly, absorbing the contents. Tyrion offered a proposition, a potential exchange, Sansa and Arya's safe release in return for peace talks. The imp claimed to speak for the crown, albeit in an unofficial capacity. He wrote that the city was caught in a swirl of chaos with Renly's forces rumored to be marching, and that Tywin would be far more amenable to negotiation if Jaime were released or at least guaranteed safe conduct. When Robb finished, he slammed the parchment onto the table. "They want Jaime returned. They swear it will ensure my sister's freedom and open the path to peace." But how do we know it's not a trick? Ned's gaze flickered to Jaime, who stood at the edge of the council chamber with arms crossed. Well, Sir Jaime, what say you? Is your brother playing us false? Jaime shook his head, his expression unreadable. Tyrion doesn't lack cunning, but he's not malicious by nature. If he says he wants to free your daughters, he probably does. But that doesn't mean my sister or Joffrey would abide by it. Still, Tyrion wields some influence. Enough, perhaps, to broker a deal. The Great John growled, it's a fool's gamble. We give them the Kingslayer, they laugh in our faces and keep the girls. Bolton's quiet voice chimed in. Or they kill the girls if we refuse. These are Lannisters we're dealing with. A hush fell. All eyes turned to Robb and Ned. The father and son exchanged a troubled glance. Finally, Ned spoke, voice hoarse with the weight of decision. We must not let my daughters remain captive forever. If there's any hope of seeing them safely away from that viper's nest, we have to consider it. But we cannot simply hand Jaime over. We need guarantees, written and sealed, with hostages on their side to ensure good faith. Jaime remained silent. Perhaps he too realized the precariousness of his position. If he returned to King's Landing, would he be welcomed as a returning hero or reviled as a traitor? He had pledged his sword to the north. Would that oath vanish the moment he crossed the city gates? Over the next hours, arguments raged back and forth. Some lords demanded an immediate assault on the capital to rescue the Stark girls by force. Others insisted that any chance at a peaceful solution, however slim, was worth pursuing. Every plan carried risks, exposing the North's flank, dividing their forces, or trusting the word of Lannisters. Eventually, Ned raised a hand to quell the heated debate. Send word to Tyrion. We will parley, but only under agreed conditions, a neutral meeting ground outside the city. We will come with our retinue and they may bring theirs, but no large host. If they refuse, we'll know their offer is false. Robb nodded firmly, seconding his father's plan. They drafted a careful response specifying that Jaime would not be released outright but brought to the talks to ensure the immediate release of Sansa and Arya. Once the girls were safe in the Northmen's hands, only then would Jaime be allowed to decide if he remained or returned with the Lannisters. It was an unconventional arrangement, but war made for strange bargains. Jaime's reaction was measured. I suppose that's fair, he said, though his tone suggested he doubted Tywin or Cersei would agree. The Raven departed with their missive. Days slipped by in a haze of drills and watchful waiting. Harrenhal's great courtyard echoed with the clang of steel on steel, the grunt of men practicing shield walls. Tension thrummed in the air, an undercurrent of dread that came from standing at the edge of a precipice. They had set forces in motion. Would Tyrion answer, and if so, with what demands? Near the end of the second week, a raven arrived bearing Tyrion's acceptance. The words were carefully crafted. He would come with a small escort to a location west of the Blackwater Rush, near a ruined September. There, they would exchange hostages. Tyrion's message ended with a flourish of wit about trusting a man known for his wiles. It was settled. Robb would lead a delegation along with Ned, keeping the bulk of their forces at Harrenhal in case of treachery. They would bring Jaime under heavy guard as well as a small retinue of knights and archers. The Greyjohn howled his disapproval, wanting to personally guard his king. Bolton insisted on sending a handful of his men, their eyes cold and predatory. Catelyn, anxious to see her daughters, begged to come, but Ned refused to risk her safety. Instead, Edmure Tully offered to accompany them, resolute in his desire to see a peaceful resolution for the Riverlands. The appointed day dawned under pale sunlight. The war party set out from Harrenhal, horses kicking up dust along the overgrown roads. The further they traveled from the cursed fortress, the more the land showed signs of the war's scars: burnt farms, ransacked villages, fields of muddy battlefields where corpses still lingered in shallow graves. Jaime rode in silence, his expression grim. Occasionally Ned caught him glancing west, as though torn between longing for home and dreading what awaited him there. Tension hung thick as they finally reached the old September. Its walls were crumbling, roof caved in. Once a place of worship, it now stood as a monument to the realm's decline. Banners snapped in the breeze, the direwolf of Stark, the trout of Tully, and flying from a nearby ridge, the crimson and gold of House Lannister. A small retinue of Lannister men waited, armed but subdued in number. At their head stood Tyrion Lannister, clad in black and crimson doublet, his mismatched eyes sharp as he watched the Northmen approach. Ned reined him beside Robb, scanning the field. No sign of a larger force, he muttered. But keep watch all the same. The two groups faced each other across the open space. Robb dismounted, face stern, and Ned followed. Tyrion stepped forward with a guarded smile. He offered a courtly bow. King in the north, Lord Stark, how splendid to see you both looking well and alive. Robb's mouth tightened. I wish the same could be said for my sisters. Where are they? Tyrion's gaze flickered. Safe for the moment. We've arranged for their transport to a location near here, under the watch of men I trust. But you'll understand if I'm cautious. Show me Jaime and we can proceed. Under the watchful stares of both sides, Jaime was led forward. The guards parted, revealing him in stark leathers rather than the lion-crested armor he once wore. Tyrion's face registered relief, then confusion and concern all at once. Brother, you look changed. A dry smile touched Jaime's lips. What is that? Are the girls truly safe, Tyrion? Tyrion held Jaime's gaze. Yes. For now. But time is short and eyes are on us. I need to bring you back under certain conditions or the crown will never sanction their release. Negotiations began in hushed, intense tones. Tyrion promised to produce Sansa and Arya, physically unharmed, in exchange for Jaime's safe passage. But Ned and Robb insisted that the girls be brought forth immediately. They refused to relinquish Jaime until their safety was guaranteed. Tension soared, men on both sides gripping sword hilts. In the midst of the standoff, Tyrion signaled to one of his men. A half-dozen riders spurred away, returning a short while later with a small covered wagon in tow. Hearts pounded. Ned's breath caught in his throat, praying to the old gods that his daughters were inside. The wagon halted and the flap opened. Sansa emerged first, hair disheveled, eyes red from tears. She stumbled into the sunlight, searching desperately until she spotted Ned and Robb. Then Arya tumbled out behind her, face smudged with dirt, a fierce scowl contorting her features. The Stark men almost sagged with relief at the sight of both girls, alive and relatively unharmed. An outcry rose among the northern retinue, a surge of protective rage. Ned moved forward, arms wide. Sansa, Arya, my sweet girls. He pulled them into a tight embrace, hardly believing they were real. Robb's face twisted with emotion, tears threatening. Tyrion raised a cautioning hand. We're not finished, Lord Stark. The arrangement was for Jaime to be freed if you have your daughters now. But Ned, still holding his daughters, locked eyes with Jaime. This was the moment. Did they honor the agreement or risk everything by refusing? Robb's voice broke the hush. Father, we gave our word. We have Sansa and Arya, let us hold to our honor. Ned nodded, though his heart clenched. Slowly, he turned to Jaime. You have kept your oath as much as any man in this war can. If you wish to return with your brother, we won't stop you. But know this, if you raise your sword against the North again, there will be no mercy. Jaime inhaled, eyes flickering with conflict. Across the space, Tyrion watched anxiously. Finally, Jaime stepped forward. I owe you thanks for sparing my life and for giving me the chance to do something worthwhile with it. He glanced back at Tyrion. If I return, I suspect our father will be less than pleased with my defection. Tyrion grimaced. You're probably right, but better than rotting as a prisoner. Besides, father listens to you. We might yet turn this into a lasting peace. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Ned and Robb stood with Sansa and Arya. Jaime joined Tyrion. The exchange was done, but whether it truly heralded peace remained uncertain. The Northmen moved to shield the Stark girls, while Lannister guards closed ranks around Jaime and Tyrion. A fragile moment of possibility shimmered in the ruin of the old sept like the last rays of sunlight before dusk. Then, as if on cue, a horn sounded from the ridge. All eyes snapped upward. A lone rider galloped into view, banner snapping behind him. Another arrival, friend or foe? No one could be sure. But as the hoofbeats pounded closer, everyone sensed that this war was not over. It had only entered a new and perilous phase. Then, as if on cue, a horn sounded from the ridge. All eyes snapped upward. A lone rider galloped into view, banner snapping behind him. Another arrival, friend or foe? No one could be sure. But as the hoofbeats pounded closer, everyone sensed that the war was not over. It had only entered a new and perilous phase. A tension far heavier than before settled over the battered ruins of the September. Men on both sides reached for swords or axes. Sansa gasped, clinging to Ned, while Arya's knuckles whitened on the hilt of the short blade she still gripped. Tyrion braced one hand against the pommel of a dagger at his waist. Jaime's attention flickered between his brother, the incoming rider, and the ring of grim-faced Stark men arrayed behind Ned and Robb. Dust clouded behind the lone horseman's mount. As he drew near, it became apparent he was no ordinary outrider. His armor bore the sigil of House Tully, a leaping trout against a field of red and blue. No Lannister standard. No immediate threat. Edmure Tully's eyes narrowed in recognition, and he strode forward a pace, calling out, "Ho, there. State your business." The rider reined in hard, chest heaving from the gallop. "My lords," he said breathlessly, "I come from the outskirts of Duskendale. Word travels fast on the roads. Lord Tywin's forces are moving east, and we have new tidings of King Renly's host. Robb's brow knit and Ned's hold on his daughters tightened. Jaime observed the messenger with a clenched jaw, wondering if Tywin had chosen this very moment to strike. If so, the exchange here in the ruin might be rendered meaningless. Tyrion's gaze flickered, nerves clear in his mismatched eyes. "Speak," said Ned, his calm voice carrying the unspoken urgency of a father desperate for answers. "What of Tywin? Is he marching for King's Landing?" "In part, my lord." The rider dismounted awkwardly, tugging at his horse's reins. "But not all his force. Some squads ride toward the Trident, possibly to move north of Harrenhal. Others gather near Rosby and Stokeworth, perhaps to shield the capital. And we have unconfirmed reports that Lord Tywin himself is heading along the Gold Road as if to intercept someone from the west." Jaime stiffened. That sounded like the typical breadth of Tywin's strategy, splitting his armies, forcing his enemies to guess where the hammer would fall. Tyrion gave a thin, knowing smile. Father does love his multiple prongs. Edmure spoke next. "And Renly's host? Are they truly on the march for King's Landing?" The rider paused, swallowing hard. "They are, my lord. The Tyrells have joined him in earnest, tens of thousands by rumor. Siege engines roll behind them. Men say King Renly hopes to surround the city before Tywin can muster a proper defense. Already there are scouts in the Crownlands wearing the rose or the stag." A new hush spread across the clearing. Robb studied the Lannister contingent, Jaime especially. Then he turned to Ned. "So Renly is pressing his claim now, father. And Tywin is torn between protecting the city and safeguarding his own seat in the west." Tyrion cleared his throat. "Meaning King's Landing stands on the edge of a blade. Joffrey may soon lose his hold unless father can drive off Renly. But that also leaves the west vulnerable, and the gold mines at Casterly Rock are the cornerstone of our family's wealth." Even the short exchange was enough to confirm the realm was in a new state of upheaval. Sansa, pale as milk, whispered, "Father, what does this mean for King Joffrey?" "And the Queen?" Arya snorted at the mention of Joffrey, eyes hard with remembered anger, but Ned laid a calming hand on her shoulder. "We'll speak of that soon," he murmured. He turned his attention to Tyrion. "These developments only underscore that any peace here is fragile. We have our daughters back." His voice grew a touch softer as he glanced at Sansa and Arya, "and for the moment, that was our chief goal. But the question remains, what do we do with Jaime Lannister?" Jaime stepped forward. "As agreed, I'll return with Tyrion. But I'm no fool. My father will question my loyalty, and I may not have the influence you hope for. If it comes to open war again, I'll do what I can to prevent further bloodshed, but I make no promises. My oath was to fight for the North for your chance at peace." A dozen onlookers scowled. Great John Umber let out a low growl. "An oath that ends the moment you step away from our camp? And we're just to believe you'll hold to any code?" Tyrion raised his palms, trying for diplomacy. "My lords, we all have an interest in avoiding unnecessary slaughter. Jaime has proven his willingness to help you thus far. If my father insists on war, that's hardly Jaime's fault. But perhaps we can now." A fierce bark from Arya cut through the tension. "Enough talk. If you're going, then just go. You've done some good by helping father and Robb get us back, but I won't forget that you were in King's Landing while we were prisoners. You could have helped us sooner." Jaime's face twitched, but he only nodded. "I could have," he admitted, and there was a note of self-reproach in his tone. "I'm not proud of everything that's happened." Arya's lip curled. She said nothing more, but her silent condemnation weighed heavier than any lord's threats. Tyrion, sensing the precarious mood, signaled two of his men to guide the wagon that had carried the girls. "We'll be off then, before another horn or another message sets everyone's nerves ablaze." He looked at Ned and Robb. "I trust you'll let us depart in peace." Robb's voice was quiet but resonant. "Yes. Go. We have no quarrel with you in this moment. If your father brings battle to us again, we will respond in kind." Tyrion dipped his head in acknowledgement. Jaime, after a long look at Ned and another at the girls, swung onto his horse. Without further ceremony, the Lannisters turned as one, riding west with haste. Jaime never glanced back. Sansa let out a trembling sigh, gazing toward the receding party. To her, King's Landing was a swirl of ghastly memories. Joffrey's cruelty, the Queen's schemes. Arya glowered, as if wishing to fling a knife between Jaime's shoulder blades. But Ned's relief at his daughter's safety overrode all else. He placed a gentle hand on each girl, then turned to Robb. "We have what we came for. Let us return to Harrenhal before there's further danger." Edmure looked uneasy. I dislike letting them ride off so easily, but we must keep our word. The Tully name cannot be tarnished by dishonor. Yet I fear Tywin will see this as a sign of weakness. It's our best chance at avoiding more carnage, Robb replied. We needed Sansa and Arya free, or we'd have had no leverage. Now we at least stand on somewhat even ground. Ned's face was grave. If Tywin means to unleash the brunt of his forces across the Riverlands or near the Trident, we must be ready. Every man who can carry a spear must muster at Harrenhal. At least we'll have the fortress's walls to shield us if it comes to siege. Without further delay, the Northmen and Tully men drew back from the ruined sept, gathering themselves for the ride home. Sansa and Arya rode beside Ned, though Arya insisted on a horse of her own, refusing to be doubled up like some helpless child. She flashed a fierce grin when the stable hands gave her the reins. Sansa, still visibly shaken, pressed closer to her father. In the swirl of departure, the messenger from Duskendale lingered to rest briefly, then accompanied them. All the while, a nameless dread coiled in Ned's chest. He had his girls, but the realm was no closer to peace. Renly advanced. Tywin and the Lannisters might lash out at any moment. And who knew what alliances Walder Frey might secretly forge? The war was not done, not by half. They rode through a landscape painted with misery. Splintered farmhouses, burnt hovels, and fields abandoned in the wake of passing armies. Men, women, and children either fled or cowered in whatever shelter remained. Occasional outriders galloped ahead, ensuring no enemy ambush awaited them. By the time the battlements of Harrenhal rose on the horizon, the sky had deepened into the smoky hue of approaching dusk. Lights glimmered in the windows of the fortress. Ned found himself surprisingly grateful for Harrenhal's looming presence, cursed though it was. Behind its massive walls, they could at least rest for a time. Once inside, they wasted no time closing the gates. Men posted archers on the ramparts. They still remembered the stories of how Harrenhal, huge, haunted Harrenhal, had changed hands time and again during this war. At the courtyard, crowds gathered to see the return of the Stark King and his father. Whispers raced from man to man. The Stark girls were free. Sansa and Arya dismounted under 100 watchful gazes, some cheering softly, others offering cautious smiles. For a moment, the grim atmosphere lightened, as if the men felt they had actually gained a victory, not by swords, but by some cunning exchange. Catelyn stood near the old stable building, and her expression when she saw her daughters was one of pure, raw relief. She ran to them, enveloping both in her arms. Sansa burst into tears, while Arya stiffened at the display of affection but did not pull away. Ned let them have a private moment before quietly escorting them into the keep, away from prying eyes. In one of the smaller solar chambers, lit by a single flickering torch, Catelyn fussed over the girls, checking their faces, their arms, their hair, as if to confirm they were truly there. Sansa sank onto a bench, exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Arya leaned against a wall, refusing to sit, as though she might spring into action at any second. Ned spoke softly. "Tell us what happened in King's Landing. Were you hurt?" Sansa wiped her eyes. They kept me in the Red Keep. The Queen wanted me close. She made me write letters to you, to Robb, urging you to bend the knee. She threatened me sometimes, threatened to hurt me if I didn't obey. At that, Arya's voice rang out sharp. She threatened me too. But I escaped the keep for a time. I was on the streets, father. Eventually, the Lannisters caught me near the Mudgate. There was shame and anger in her tone, but also a feral pride that she had at least tried to stay out of their clutches. They stuck me in a cell for days, maybe weeks. I lost track. Catelyn's eyes brimmed with tears, and she pulled Arya closer, pressing her hand to the girl's cheek. "You're safe now." Arya's shoulders dropped a fraction, but she did not fully relax. "I want to fight them," she said fiercely. "All of them. Especially Joffrey. He's cruel. Worse than I even imagined after seeing him kill Lady and hearing about all he's done." Ned shuddered at the memory of the direwolf's fate, of how quickly cruelty had become a hallmark of the Boy King. We'll see that Joffrey answers for his crimes in this life or the next. But for now, we have larger concerns. He may not be king for much longer if Renly's host reaches the capital. Sansa looked up, eyes wide. Is that good or bad? If Renly takes the throne, what will become of the Lannisters? Robb, who stood in the doorway, folded his arms. "We don't know yet, Sansa. Renly's no friend to the north. He's just another Baratheon who wants the Iron Throne. At best, he might be more reasonable than Joffrey. At worst, he might keep the same advisors, the same methods. A hush fell. Outside, the wind rattled through the blackened towers. Harrenhal never let its inhabitants forget the weight of history, the curses that had supposedly befallen house after house that tried to hold it. Ned cleared his throat. Let the girls rest, Cat. We'll speak more in the morning. And so it was that Catelyn led Sansa and Arya to a set of small, relatively clean chambers. A pair of loyal Stark guards stationed themselves outside, determined to keep them safe from any lurking Bolton men or the usual horrors rumored to haunt Harrenhal. Neither girl slept well that night, their dreams filled with memories of King's Landing's terrors and the uncertain future that stretched before them. Elsewhere in the castle, Ned and Robb convened a gathering of their closest advisors. Edmure Tully, Roose Bolton, the Great John, Midge Mormont, and the newly arrived bannermen from the north assembled in a torchlit hall that once might have hosted grand feasts. Now, only the hush of war planning filled the space. Maps draped a long trestle table, corners pinned by daggers. Wax dribbled from dozens of candles, each flickering flame distorting shadows on the scarred walls. Robb, as king in the north, stood at the head of the table, though Ned remained close by his right side. A hush fell over the lords. Robb began. We have my sisters back. That's one victory. But the war goes on. Tywin Lannister is splitting his forces, some moving east, others holding west, and we cannot be certain of his next strike. Midge Mormont planted her fists on the table. If Tywin tries to pass north of Harrenhal, could he threaten the neck? Cut off our route to the north? Roose Bolton's voice came out smooth, a dangerous whisper beneath. Possible. Or he could simply encircle us here. Harrenhal is strong, yes, but not impregnable. And it's too large, ironically difficult to defend all its walls if attacked by overwhelming numbers. This fortress has changed hands enough times to prove that. Edmure Tully chimed in, Josette. We have the support of the Riverlands, or what's left of them. If we garrison Harrenhal too heavily, though, who defends Riverrun and the other towns against raids? A moment of uneasy agreement settled. They were stretched thin, even with new arrivals from the north. And Tywin's capacity for cruelty and cunning was well known. If he felt spite by Jaime's captivity and subsequent departure under suspiciously cooperative circumstances, he might unleash the full strength of the Lannisters on them. Ned's gaze settled on a small marker on the map representing Casterly Rock. Jaime said before he left that an attack on the rock might be the key to forcing Tywin's hand. But that's a distant campaign, especially with the phrase being unreliable allies. He paused, thinking of Walder Frey's many sons and grandsons, the labyrinth of alliances that man cultivated. We could attempt to treat with Walder again, secure the twins, and push a force west. But that leaves the rest of the Riverlands open. Robb frowned. If we hold here at Harrenhal, we might lure Tywin into open battle. Perhaps we can force terms. But that depends on Tywin's mood and whether he sees advantage in fighting us first or dealing with Renly's threat in the south. Conversation swirled, each lord offering a take on how best to deploy their limited resources. No one had a perfect solution. In truth, no perfect solution existed. The realm was too fractured, the lines of loyalty too blurred, the ambitions of kings too numerous. All they could do was decide on a course and commit. Ultimately, Robb spoke the final word. We'll fortify Harrenhal for now. The Riverlords under Edmure's banner will continue to defend their own lands with some reinforcements from the north. The bulk of our host remains here, ready to march out if Tywin draws near. We watch the roads. If we see a chance to strike west without compromising our position, we'll seize it. Otherwise, we stand firm. A rumble of assent, if reluctant, filled the hall. Outside, the wind moaned and the gloom of Harrenhal seemed to thicken. The next weeks passed intense vigilance. Scouts reported sporadic Lannister movements across the Riverlands. Some villages were looted, but no massive army approached Harrenhal directly. The men drilled daily, forging a routine that lent a semblance of stability. Sansa and Arya slowly recovered from their ordeals, though both remained shadowed by their memories. Arya took to practicing with her blade in the courtyard, sometimes drawing nervous or bemused looks from the northern soldiers. But they whispered she's Ned Stark's daughter, and that alone earned her a wary respect. Sansa gravitated to needlework for solace, but her heart wasn't in it. At times, she found herself wandering the ramparts with her mother, eyes drawn to the horizon as though she expected to see the spires of the Red Keep at any moment. She confided in Catelyn her fears that Joffrey would come for her again, or that she would wake and find herself back in that gilded prison. Catelyn reassured her, but the lines of worry on her face only deepened. This war had no guarantees. Each day, Ned conferred with Robb, passing on any new rumors. They heard that Renly Baratheon had reached the Rose Road, that his banners fluttered from Marjorie Tyrell's carriage, and that they might siege King's Landing by full summer. They heard that Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be gathering ships at Dragonstone, though none were certain how large his fleet might be. And always the question lingered, where was Tywin's main strength and when would it strike? Late one afternoon, a scout galloped into Harrenhal's courtyard, cloak torn and splattered with mud. He dropped from his horse and demanded an audience with Lord Stark and King Robb at once. In the same musty war room as before, the scout delivered his news breathlessly. A large Lannister army was on the march, not toward Harrenhal but southwest, through the goldfields around the Red Fork. Reports indicated Tywin might be aiming to secure the route to the Rock, or to block any attempt at a western offensive by the Starks. Edmure Tully gritted his teeth. That means my homeland is threatened again. They'll pillage villages near Riverrun. We can't let them run rampant. Robb weighed the options. We either ride out to engage them on open ground or we attempt a different strategy. If we meet them in pitched battle, can we be sure of victory? Ned studied the map. Not sure. Tywin's men are seasoned and their numbers might be equal or greater than ours. But if we allow them free rein, the Riverlands will suffer. Roose Bolton offered a quiet suggestion. We could try to lure a portion of Tywin's men into an ambush near the Red Fork. Harrenhal's cavalry could harry their flanks, forcing them to split. We'd need coordination, though. And we risk losing the fortress if Tywin doubles back. Robb pressed his lips together. It's a gamble. Yet we cannot stand idle while the Riverlands burn anew. Ned rested a hand on his son's shoulder. We could leave a strong garrison here, enough to hold Harrenhal while the bulk of our forces move against Tywin. If he's truly heading west, he may not expect us to chase him. He might think we'd dig in. Edmure straightened. My uncle Brynden knows the terrain near the Red Fork well. With his guidance, we could choose where to meet Tywin's host. A place to our advantage. A plan began to form. Brynden the Blackfish would scout ahead, picking the ground for a decisive battle. Robb would lead the northern cavalry and a corps of seasoned foot soldiers along with the river lords. Harrenhal would remain under Ned Stark's control, fortified by enough men to repel an assault if Tywin somehow doubled back or if other enemies appeared. Over the following days, preparations moved swiftly. Horses were shod. Wagons loaded with provisions. Armor and weaponry repaired. Each soldier in Robb's contingent was told they might not see Harrenhal again for many weeks. Or at all, if fortune turned against them. Catelyn pressed Robb's hands in hers before he departed. Be careful, my son. We have Sansa and Arya safe now, but I couldn't bear to lose you or your father again. Robb tried for a reassuring smile. We'll do what we must. With luck, we can strike a blow that brings Tywin to the table. Or at least spares more innocent lives. Arya surprised everyone by stepping forward and demanding to ride with Robb's army. She insisted she could be of use, that she wouldn't cower behind walls. Ned, however, forbade it in a tone that brooked no argument. Arya stomped off, but Sansa quietly admitted relief that her little sister wouldn't be riding to war. Soon enough, Robb's host filed out of Harrenhal's yawning gates. Thousands of boots trampled the soft earth as banners of the direwolf, the trout, the flayed man, and lesser sigils fluttered in a stiff wind. Edmure Tully rode near Robb, while the great Jon and Meege Mormont led separate divisions, each bristling with spears and swords. Drums rumbled and horns sounded a low dirge as they vanished into the distance, leaving Ned, Catelyn, the girls, and a substantial garrison behind. In Harrenhal's courtyard, the emptiness felt profound. Ned stared after them long after they disappeared beyond the horizon. Something in his bones warned him that the war would not be decided by one battle. Too many threads were in play. Renly's march on King's Landing, Stannis' unknown designs, Tywin's cunning, and the ever-unpredictable Walder Frey. But if Robb could gain even a small advantage, perhaps it might tilt the realm toward a stable peace, if any peace could be stable in these times. Days bled into nights, and the watchers on Harrenhal's ramparts grew restless. Scouts trickled back with scattered reports. Tywin's forces were indeed near the Red Fork. Raiding parties clashed with outriders loyal to the Tullus. No decisive engagement yet. The tension was excruciating. Catelyn took solace in having her daughters nearby, though she spent sleepless hours pacing the corridors. Sansa tried to comfort her with songs, though her voice quavered and often gave out. Arya roamed the fortress in restless agitation, rarely parted from the small sword she'd named Needle. Ned oversaw the defense, ensuring ballistae were mounted in strategic points along Harrenhal's massive walls, setting watchers in the high towers. Ravens perched in the rookery ready to bear urgent messages if any new threat arose. Each time a rider appeared on the horizon, hearts pounded, fearing a Lannister army. But again and again it proved to be a mere messenger or a supply cart. At last, near mid-morning on a clear day, a herald arrived bearing dire tidings. He was a tully man, cloaked in mud and sweat, eyes wild. The courtyard hushed as he collapsed from his horse. Ned himself rushed forward with several guards, easing the man up. "Speak," Ned commanded urgently. "What news from the Red Fork?" The herald coughed, swallowing hard. A battle was joined, near the Tumblestone. Robb's forces clashed with Lord Tywin. It's not certain how the fight will end. Our lines are strong, but so are theirs. The Grey John led a charge, broke through part of the Lannister flank, but Tywin's reinforcements arrived. Ned's chest constricted. "So the fighting continues?" "Aye, Lord Stark. It may rage for days. The Lannisters are entrenched, but so are we. We formed a ring around them, trying to starve them of supplies. King Robb wanted you to know, if Tywin tries to slip away, he might attempt to feint, sending men toward Harrenhal. Be on guard." Ned nodded grimly. "Thank you. Rest now. We'll keep watch." In the hours that followed, the entire fortress buzzed with preparation. Men oiled their armor, sharpened swords, tested the tension in bowstrings. Catelyn, though worried sick, maintained a poised front, tending to logistical matters, ensuring there were enough rations, that wounded men from earlier skirmishes were well cared for. Sansa and Arya helped as they could. Arya took to the stables, learning to feed and calm the horses, while Sansa wrote neatly in the ledger books, chronicling supplies. In any other world, it might have been mundane, but here, every small task felt like a direct contribution to the war effort. News arrived sporadically. One raven squawked into the rookery, bearing word that Robb had inflicted heavy losses on the Lannister left flank, yet Tywin himself remained unscathed. Another message declared that Edmure Tully had taken a wound, an arrow to the thigh, but still commanded his men. Then came rumors that Roose Bolton's approach from the north had cornered a Lannister vanguard near the river. But nothing definitive. The only certainty was that the battle raged on. Finally, on a drizzly afternoon, a larger party of riders was spotted from Harrenhal's battlements. Ned led a contingent to the gate, hearts pounding at the possibility of Tywin's approach. The standard-bearer's banner was difficult to identify through the slanting rain, but soon they saw the Stark dire wolf and Tully trout. Relief warred with dread. Had the battle ended? And in whose favor? The gates opened and 100 horsemen rode in, mud-splattered and hollow-eyed. Many bore bandages. Some had fresh blood seeping through ripped surcoats. At their head rode Roose Bolton, pale as ever, but sporting a bandaged arm. He dismounted gingerly. His men helped a wounded knight from his saddle, moaning softly. Ned hastened forward. "Lord Bolton," Ned said, voice terse with worry. "What news from the battle?" Bolton's eyes, cool as winter, flicked over Ned's face. "We fought Tywin near the Tumblestone for days. Both sides took heavy losses. King Robb is alive, though battered. Tywin managed to slip away in the night. He left a rearguard to stall us while he withdrew west." A murmur spread among the onlooking garrison. Ned's chest eased slightly. Robb was alive, though not victorious. So Tywin retreated toward the rock? Bolton nodded, mouth tightening. "He lost many men, but so did we. The field is a slaughter. Bodies stretch for leagues. Great John Umber is wounded but surviving. Edmure Tully likewise. Our own forces are in disarray, but King Robb pursues Tywin, hoping to keep him from regrouping." Catelyn had hurried into the courtyard by then, overhearing. Her voice trembled with relief. "Thank the gods he still lives. Did Robb send you here, Lord Bolton?" "I've volunteered to return with our wounded. We also aim to resupply before joining King Robb again. He marches west in haste, hoping to catch Tywin on open ground. But Tywin is cunning. He may double back or lead Robb into a trap." Ned felt a pang of apprehension. Robb was young, a brilliant strategist in his own right, but Tywin Lannister had decades of experience. Then we must do what we can to support him. Harrenhal remains secure. We'll send fresh rations and any uninjured men we can spare. Roose Bolton inclined his head. "We need them soon, Lord Stark. The men who remain in the field are exhausted. Some are demoralized by the scale of the carnage." Thus began a whirlwind of logistical flurry. Harrenhal's stores of grain, salted fish, and dried fruits were parceled out. Spare arms and armor were loaded onto wagons. Ned personally oversaw these preparations, conferring with stewards and quartermasters at length. Catelyn helped organize healers for those too wounded to continue. Sansa and Arya pitched in where they could, Sansa at the counting tables, Arya darting about the castle delivering messages. All the while, Roose Bolton's presence cast a quiet pall. He spoke in a subdued tone, never raising his voice, yet his men followed his every command with crisp obedience. To see their pale leathers emblazoned with the flayed man of House Bolton unsettled many of the Riverland's soldiers. Still, in the dire straits of war, alliances of necessity held them together. Within 2 days, the battered detachment that arrived with Bolton was rested and resupplied, along with a few hundred additional men from Harrenhal's garrison. Ned stood by the gates as they departed, each rider solemnly saluting him. Bolton gave a curt nod in farewell. "Pray we find King Robb quickly, and that Tywin doesn't slip the net once more." "I pray for it day and night," Ned replied. "The longer this war drags on, the more the realm bleeds." Bolton led his men out onto the muddy roads. Their forms disappeared into the early morning mist, heading west in pursuit of Tywin. Ned lingered, gazing at the empty horizon once again, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of responsibility. That same day, a raven arrived from King's Landing, an official parchment sealed with the royal sigil, though the script inside bore none of the king's actual hand. The short message demanded that Eddard Stark and his rebellious son lay down their arms at once, or face the crown's wrath. Signed by Cersei Lannister, regent for King Joffrey Baratheon, it reeked of desperation. Another note accompanied it, from an unknown source, warning that Renly Baratheon's host drew ever closer, that the city seethed with panic. Ned read both messages and felt a grim satisfaction. The crown's demand was empty posturing. Cersei could not afford to open another front when Renly threatened from the south and Tywin reeled in the west. He had the queen's letter read aloud in the courtyard for the men, so they might share in that slight victory of defiance. A faint ripple of laughter coursed through the ranks at the idea that Joffrey believed he still had the power to command them. Yet behind the laughter lurked the grim truth. If Renly or Stannis took the Iron Throne, the North's position was still uncertain. They had crowned Robb king in the north, not some southern potentate. Could any real peace be made? Or would this simply trade one enemy for another? Days turned into another fortnight. Scouts arrived with contradictory rumors. Tywin was pinned against the western hills, or Tywin had outmaneuvered Robb once more, or the Great John had forced a partial victory. The truth was elusive. No messenger brought definitive word. Harrenhal's garrison remained on constant alert, archers scanning the horizon from the melted towers, men patrolling the labyrinthine corridors below. Tedium warred with dread. All the while, Ned took quiet comfort in having Sansa and Arya there, though he worried for Robb's safety. Eventually, an outpouring of wounded men straggled in. Some battered foot soldiers from the Riverlands, a handful of northern knights with scorch marks across their armor, and more than a few Bolton men nursing grisly injuries. Their stories painted a chaotic picture. Robb had pressed Tywin hard, scattering the Lannister foot in the western hills. There had been a savage clash near a ruined village. No name, just burnt huts and fields of ash. Tywin, cornered, had been forced to stand and fight. Reports varied on the outcome, but word circulated that Tywin's own horse had been cut from under him. A rumor claimed that Great John Umber had nearly gotten Tywin in an axe blow to the skull, only for the Lannister guard to drag their lord away at the last moment. Ned listened to these accounts with a sense of building dread. A victory over Tywin might be the turning point they needed, but it sounded like a near-run thing, no conclusive triumph. One wounded Bolton man whispered of how the Kingslayer, Jaime, had reappeared on the field, leading a relief party of Lannister men. Ned questioned him intently. "Are you certain? We were told Jaime parted ways from King's Landing. Did you see him plainly?" "As plainly as I see you, Lord," the soldier muttered, trembling from fever. "He was on a white courser, golden armor shining. Cut down 3 of our men in quick succession. He's back with his father, it seems." Ned's worst suspicions came to life. Jaime had returned to Tywin, effectively ending any notion that he might remain loyal to the North. That might have been inevitable, but it still tasted bitter. Jaime's vow to redeem House Lannister left in tatters, overshadowed by familial duty. The old cynicism rose in Ned's heart. Perhaps a Lannister truly could not be trusted. But there was no going back to change what was done. They had needed Sansa and Arya. They had them. That would have to suffice. Another messenger from Robb arrived at the gates, requesting immediate meeting with Lord Stark. Ned hurried to the war room to find Catelyn, Sansa, Arya, and several lords already assembled. Into the circle came a Tully guard, limping slightly, helmet tucked under one arm. He bowed low. "My lord, King Robb sends this missive." He handed over a sealed parchment. "He says the situation is dire. Tywin is not wholly broken. He's regrouped near the Golden Tooth. Jaime is confirmed to have joined him with fresh troops from the Westerlands. Our own forces are ragged from constant battle. King Robb asks that you gather every able man you can spare and march west to reinforce him, or we risk losing the advantage entirely." A hush. Ned glanced at Catelyn, who looked stricken but resolute. Arya's eyes gleamed with something like fierce excitement. She'd never lost her appetite for action. Sansa turned pale, remembering the horrors of Lannister power. The assembled lords exchanged worried glances. Harrenhal was large, but only so many men remained here. If they emptied the fortress, would they leave it vulnerable to other threats? Catelyn spoke, voice quavering only slightly. "Ned, if Robb needs you, you must go to him. He has been holding Tywin at bay this long, but no army can endure forever without aid." Ned's jaw tightened. "Yes, I must." He looked around at the lords. "But I cannot take everyone. Harrenhal must not fall or the Riverlands W. They'll be left bare. I'll lead a relief force. The rest stay here to hold the castle." The Great John was absent, already in the field, so Ned turned to the other northern lords present. Men like Lord Serwyn, Lord Tallheart, and a handful of Manderly knights. "Gather your men. We ride on the morrow. We'll leave enough to hold Harrenhal under the command of Lord Willis Manderly, if he accepts." Lord Willis, a portly man with a surprisingly stern face, bowed stiffly. "I accept, my lord. I'll keep Harrenhal secure until your return or until King Robb calls." Thus it was decided. The next hours were a blur of preparation. Men scrambled to pack rations, hoist weapon crates onto wagons, load the many war horses. The fortress reverberated with the clank of armor. Arya once again pleaded to join, but Ned denied her firmly, though her protests were louder than before. Sansa, though no less concerned for her father's safety, helped gather medical supplies to send with the departing host. Late that night, Ned stood atop Harrenhal's highest intact tower, gazing at the distant stars. Catelyn found him there, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. She approached quietly, laying a hand on his arm. "You'll come back," she said, not quite a question. Ned exhaled, his breath misting in the night air. "I have to. Our family, our realm, still needs peace. We're dancing on the edge of a knife, cat. If we can't break Tywin's power soon, this war will devour us all." She pressed closer, eyes reflecting the faint torchlight. "Robb is strong, and you'll be there to guide him. Together, you can do what must be done." He kissed her forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. "Stay safe within these walls. Look after the girls. Should Harrenhal come under threat, you must send word immediately." They parted at dawn. Ned led a modest but resolute force out of the gate. The columns of infantry, cavalry, and supply carts stretched for a quarter-mile. Catelyn, Sansa, and Arya stood on the ramparts to watch him go. Tears pricked at all their eyes, though Arya tried to hide it behind a scowl of frustration. Ned looked back once, raising a hand in farewell. Then he was gone, swallowed by the same roads that had taken Robb from them. In the days that followed, Harrenhal fell into a heavy lull. Waiting, always waiting, Catelyn steeled herself by attending to the fortress's governance. She met with Lord Willis Manderly to discuss rationing, oversaw small disputes among the men, and quietly ensured that the Tully and Bolton troops cooperated. Sansa resumed her duties in the ledgers. Arya roamed every inch of the fortress, from the high ramparts to the dank dungeons. Sometimes she practiced swordplay with a few soldiers kind enough, or bored enough, to indulge her. Other times, she simply stared out at the horizon, yearning to be where the Real fight was. Messages from the front grew infrequent. One raven arrived, telling of small skirmishes near the hills. Another claimed that Tywin was fortifying a position near the pass leading to Casterly Rock. No mention of a decisive battle. No mention of Ned or Robb, though presumably they were with the host that was gathering to face Tywin once more. Then, one dawn, a series of horns blared from the walls. Caitlin, who had been dozing fitfully in a tower chamber, startled awake. She rushed to the courtyard, Sansa close behind, hearts hammering. Arya came skidding into view as well, boots clattering on the stone. Lord Willis Manderley stood near the gatehouse, barking orders. "What is it?" Caitlin asked, breath catching. "Is it Tywin?" Willis shook his head. "No Lannister banners. Something else." He gestured upward to the watchman in the tower. "Well, man, speak." A guard on the rampart shouted down, their riders, "My lord," coming from the east. "Banners, it looks like Renly's sigil, the stag and the rose. And the Florent fox too. A large party but not a whole army." A ripple of confusion spread among them. Renly's men here at Harrenhal? For what purpose? Renly was supposed to be near King's Landing, or at least approaching it from the Rose Road. Even as questions buzzed, the riders were granted cautious entry. Trumpets sounded a wary flourish. The heavy gate lifted, and into the vast courtyard clattered 24 riders, their armor and cloaks bearing the golden stag of Baratheon and the golden rose of Tyrell. At the head rode a man of regal bearing, his green cloak trimmed with fur. But it was not Renly himself. Instead, the man introduced himself as Lord Mathis Rowan of Golden Grove, a known Tyrell bannerman. Alongside him was Ser Garland Tyrell, the lesser-known brother of Loras Tyrell. They dismounted calmly, taking in the imposing sprawl of Harrenhal. Caitlin stepped forward, shoulders squared. "My lords, you ride under King Renly's banner. But this is a stronghold of House Stark and Tully under King Robb. What brings you here?" Mathis Rowan gave a courtly bow, though he seemed wary. "Lady Stark and honor. We come on behalf of King Renly Baratheon. He has learned of your concentration of forces here and of the ongoing battles in the west. He wishes to propose a meeting, a parley of sorts." Willis Manderley frowned. "A parley? For what?" "Renly is marching on King's Landing. We hold the Riverlands and the north for King Robb." Ser Garland Tyrell, a tall man with a serious expression, inclined his head. "The realm is in chaos. King Renly knows that House Stark is a formidable power in the north and that you are no allies of the Lannisters. He believes an accord might benefit us all. Peace between the Baratheon and Stark claims, perhaps combined efforts to dethrone Joffrey entirely and to check Tywin's ambitions in the west." A hush descended. Caitlyn's mind raced. If Robb had been here, he could decide. But Robb was in the field. She was the highest-ranking Stark in Harrenhal at present, with Ned also gone. "You propose an alliance, then?" she asked carefully. Mathis Rowan seemed relieved by her directness. "Indeed. King Renly invites you to send an envoy to his encampment not far from the Blackwater Rush. He would treat with you or with King Robb or with any lord empowered to speak for the north. Time is of the essence. The realm bleeds while the Lannisters hold King's Landing in a stranglehold. Our combined might could end this war quickly." Caitlin exchanged a look with Sansa, who stood at her elbow, wide-eyed. Arya, behind them, muttered something about better than Joffrey, but Caitlin hushed her. "My lords, King Robb is away in pursuit of Lord Tywin. We do not know when he will return. I can dispatch a raven, but we have no certainty of how soon it might reach him." Mathis nodded gravely. "We understand. Time is short. King Renly suggests that Lady Stark herself might come to his camp if she so chooses to speak on King Robb's behalf. He acknowledges the courtesy you once showed him at Riverrun, he trusts your wisdom and hopes to avoid more bloodshed." Memories flickered through Caitlyn's mind of Renly's visit to the north long ago, fleeting but pleasant enough. He had always been the most genial Baratheon. She struggled to weigh the risks, leaving Harrenhal, traveling into uncertain territory, facing the possibility of betrayal. Yet an alliance with Renly could drastically shift the balance of power. If he truly meant to dethrone Joffrey, the North might benefit by coordinating efforts, especially if Tywin's main force was pinned or retreating. It might also help ensure that the North's independence was recognized or at least negotiated from a position of strength. She glanced at Willis Manderley and the other northern lords present. They looked uneasy but curious. Some nodded in subtle encouragement. "Lady Stark," Willis said quietly, "it may be worth hearing what Renly has to say. We have not forgotten that we declared Robb king in the north, but a southern alliance might speed peace if it's made on terms that protect our rights." Caitlin set her jaw. "Very well. I will go. I'll take a small escort. But I'll first send a raven to Robb, informing him of Renly's invitation so he knows not to mistake this for any defection." Mathis Rowan bowed once more. "King Renly anticipated your prudence. We will remain nearby until you are ready to depart." So it was decided. Within hours, a raven flew west with a message for Robb explaining Caitlyn's plan to meet Renly. She waited only one full day for a possible reply. None came. No surprise, messages in wartime were easily lost or delayed by roving bands of outlaws or scouts. With Harrenhal left in the hands of Lord Willis Manderley, Caitlin then mustered a small retinue, a dozen knights, a few trusted Riverlands riders, and to her chagrin, Arya insisted on coming too. Initially, Caitlin refused point-blank, citing the danger. But Arya's fierce gaze and repeated arguments plus Sansa's quiet admission that she had no desire to travel again so soon swayed her. "I'll keep my sword," Arya insisted. "I'm not sitting idle in Harrenhal while you and Robb and Father do all the real work. I can look after you, Mother." There was a flicker of a smile at that improbable boast, but in the end, Caitlin relented. Her youngest daughter had proven her resilience in King's Landing already. And so they departed, Lady Catelyn Stark and her small party riding out of Harrenhal's gates beneath the watchful eyes of men who prayed they'd return safely. Mathis Rowan and Ser Garland Tyrell led the way, forging a path eastward through territory that was nominally contested. Renly's men had been skirmishing with Crown loyalists. The roads were rutted, dotted with destroyed farms. Caitlin wore a cloak that covered much of her face, for the land was thick with bandits these days, and a highborn lady was a tempting target. Arya, perched on a sturdy mare, kept scanning every treeline, hand often drifting to the hilt of needle. They traveled for days, cutting across rolling plains and thin forests, the air growing heavier with each league toward the Crownlands. Occasionally, they encountered groups of Renly's outriders easily recognizable by the sigils of the Rose or the Stag. Each saluted Mathis Rowan, confirming that the king's main camp lay not far from the Blackwater Rush. Finally, upon cresting a small rise, Caitlin and her party beheld a sprawling encampment, row after row of tents, colored banners snapping in the breeze, light green for House Baratheon, Renly's personal color, gold roses for House Tyrell, foxes, bees, and a tapestry of lesser Tyrell bannermen. Soldiers milled about and the smell of horses and cooking fires filled the air. It was not as large an army as Caitlin had expected from rumors, but it was still formidable, thousands at least, maybe tens of thousands. Perhaps the rest were scattered further south or deployed in different columns. Either way, the display of power was impressive. Renly Baratheon himself awaited them near the center of the camp, standing beside a green pavilion that sported the crowned stag of Storm's End. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard, clad in polished armor chased with gold. At his side stood Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, his hair shining in the mid-morning sun, expression poised. Other highborn figures gathered around as well, including Margaery Tyrell, in a gown of deep blue embroidered with golden roses. Caitlin recognized her from prior glimpses at tournaments, young, beautiful, carrying herself with a quiet regality. For a moment, Caitlin thought how strange it was to see the Tyrells so far from Highgarden, entangled in a war for a throne that might soon be in flux yet again. Renly stepped forward, arms opening in a welcoming gesture. "Lady Stark, it is good to see you even under these unfortunate circumstances of war." His gaze flicked to Arya with amusement. "And your daughter, I presume?" Caitlin dismounted stiffly, her back sore from days of rough travel. She offered a slight bow. "Your Grace, this is my daughter, Arya Stark. We come in good faith to hear your proposals." Renly signaled a waiting page to bring refreshment. "Of course. I thank you for accepting my invitation." He glanced around, then gestured to a section of the pavilion that had been set up with chairs and a makeshift table. "Let us speak privately." Within the pavilion, the hubbub of the camp faded to a muffled backdrop. Arya stood behind her mother, one hand near Needle's pommel, watchful. Loras and Margaery took seats flanking Renly. Mathis Rowan and Ser Garland remained near the entrance, exchanging occasional glances. Caitlin slid her hood back, folding her hands calmly in her lap. Renly began, voice pitched low but confident. "Word has reached me of the North's victories against the Lannisters and your recent exchange that freed your daughters. I congratulate you on that. I also hear King Robb is pressing Tywin. I admire his courage, but I fear that while the Starks chase Tywin, the true seat of Lannister power, King's Landing, remains in Joffrey's grasp." Caitlyn's voice was cool but polite. "We have not forgotten the Boy King. But with Tywin in the field, we had to ensure the North's safety and that of our children." "Understandable," Renly said, inclining his head. "Yet the realm suffers so long as Joffrey and Cersei rule. My brother Stannis also claims the throne, but we can expect no compromise from him. He's too rigid, too proud. It was always so even before Robert's death." Loras Tyrell interjected with a subtle edge. "King Renly holds the rightful claim through the support of the major lords of the Reach and by his popularity among many of the Stormlands. He is Robert Baratheon's youngest brother, but most see him as the more fitting king, especially now that Joffrey's parentage is widely questioned. At that, Catelyn's gaze flicked to Margaery, whose expression was serene. The rumors of Joffrey's illegitimacy were no secret. If the realm believed Joffrey was the product of incest, that alone eroded his hold on the throne. I see. So, you wish for the North to align with you. But you must know that my son's men have crowned him king in the North. They will not bend the knee to a Southern king again. Renly exchanged a glance with Margaery, then spoke carefully. Yes, I am aware. And we are prepared to discuss terms that would grant the North a measure of autonomy, perhaps full autonomy, if it means we stand united against the Lannisters. Their hold on the Iron Throne must be broken. Once Joffrey is removed and the city is pacified, we can negotiate the shape of the realm. The Tyrells, the Baratheons, the Martells, everyone has a stake. But we do not relish more bloodshed than necessary. Catelyn's posture remained guarded. What exactly do you propose, Your Grace? Renly folded his hands on the table. An alliance. Military, political. The North and the Riverlands stand with me against Joffrey and any Lannisters who remain loyal to him. In return, I will recognize your independence or near independence, the details to be hammered out. Your lands remain yours, free of Southern oversight. We focus on reuniting the rest of the kingdoms under my banner. Once King's Landing falls, we legitimize these arrangements, ensuring your son, as king in the North, is recognized by all, or at least given terms that keep the North free. Silence settled. Margaery Tyrell's eyes shone with quiet confidence, while Loras looked at Arya with faint curiosity. Her youth and obvious readiness to fight must have intrigued him. Arya merely stared back, unimpressed by the famed Knight of Flowers. Catelyn let out a steadying breath. If we were to bring such terms to King Robb, he would consider them. But only if you prove your sincerity. The North remembers betrayals, and we do not take lightly the matter of who sits the Iron Throne, even if we no longer vow fealty to it. Renly nodded, the plumes of his helm swaying gently where it rested on a stand. We can offer a preliminary pact, sworn by the old gods and the new if necessary. House Tyrell and House Baratheon, my branch of it, will vow not to infringe on the sovereignty of the North or the Riverlands once the war is done. In exchange, your armies help us depose Joffrey and cleanse the crownlands of Lannister rule. It sounded almost too generous, a neat solution to years of conflict. But war rarely yielded such neat solutions, and Catelyn's suspected complexities awaited them if they reached a final victory. For instance, how would the Vale, the Iron Islands, or Dorne respond to these developments? Still, it was a conversation worth having, especially if it meant a respite from the endless bloodshed. Arya spoke up, her voice unexpectedly forceful. What about Tywin? If he rallies in the west, do you expect the North to fight him alone while you capture King's Landing? Loras Tyrell's lips thinned slightly, but Renly answered with a mild smile. Not alone, my lady. We can coordinate. Once Joffrey is removed, my host could march west to flank Tywin, cutting off his retreat. Or if Tywin is somehow subdued first, your combined forces with Robb might move south to help us take the capital. Either way, the Lannister threat would be eliminated on all fronts. Arya crossed her arms as if unimpressed. But she said nothing more. Catelyn gave her a wary look. She did not want to offend Renly's delegates needlessly. Turning back to Renly, she asked, will you wait here for my reply? Or do you wish me to remain in your camp while we send word to King Robb? We cannot finalize anything without his agreement. Renly exchanged a glance with Margaery and Loras. The queen-to-be, if Renly truly claimed the throne, spoke gently, we welcome you to stay as our guests, Lady Stark. We can provide comfort and safety while you await your son's decision. The roads are dangerous now, especially so close to the Crownlands. And if King Robb is engaged in battles, his reply might be slow in coming. Catelyn disliked the notion of leaving Harrenhal for too long, but traveling back and forth could be even riskier. She finally inclined her head. Very well. We will stay a short while on the condition that I can dispatch ravens. I must keep Harrenhal informed as well as attempt to reach King Robb. Renly smiled, the expression boyish for a moment. Of course, Lady Stark. My men will ensure your messages are carried securely. We're not far from several old watchtowers with rookeries. Now, if you'll allow, let us show you around the camp, introduce you to our lords, and make you comfortable. Our alliance must be forged on trust. And so began another unexpected chapter in this war's tapestry. Catelyn Stark and Arya were ensconced in Renly's camp, treated politely, lavishly, compared to Harrenhal's grim halls. Tents were set aside for them, warm baths offered, fresh food. Arya found it suspicious, prowling about with her short sword, reluctant to remove her leathers. Caitlin tried to maintain decorum, uneasy at the hospitality yet aware that forging a bond with Renly's faction might well reshape the entire conflict. Over the coming days, she sat in on Renly's counsels, hearing how he planned to approach King's Landing once the Tyrell host fully mustered. She gleaned that the Tyrell leadership was not monolithic. Some lords were impatient, urging a swift attack, while others counseled caution. Marjorie's voice carried weight, advocating strategic moves to ensure minimal bloodshed among the common folk. Loras Tyrell was fiercely protective of Renly, always at his side or nearby, and seemed eager for the glory of battle. Arya grew restless, occasionally slipping out to watch knights spar in the training yards or wandering among the common soldiers. She gleaned bits of gossip. That Renly might try to negotiate with Stannis, but no one believed Stannis would yield. That the city was rumored to be full of starving smallfolk. That the gold cloaks might turn cloak again if faced with a bigger army. It was a swirl of rumor and half-truth, and Arya hungered for news of her father and Robb, which never came. Finally, after more than a fortnight, a raven arrived bearing a message from Harrenhal. It was not from Robb, but from Lord Willis Manderley, informing Caitlin that no further word had come from the Western Front. Wounded still trickled into the fortress, but no decisive victory or defeat was confirmed. The letter also carried a warning. Walder Frey was rumored to be in contact with Tywin's agents, though details were scant. Caitlin felt her heart sink. The phrase might betray them at any moment, especially if they believed Tywin could still emerge victorious. She shared the contents of the letter with Renly, who merely grimaced. Walder Frey is a hazard to any side. I do not envy you that predicament. If the phrase were to block our ability to move men across the Twins, Caitlin said, it could cripple the North's ability to reinforce. Robb might be trapped in the west or forced to take a long route around. We must keep watch. Renly understood. Once King's Landing is dealt with, the phrase would have no reason to support Tywin. But that's a future matter. For now, I ask again, will the North join me against Joffrey? Will King Robb accept my terms? Caitlin managed a tight smile. I have no answer until I hear from Robb, Your Grace. We can propose a formal alliance, yes, but I cannot sign away the North's autonomy without his blessing. Renly sighed, rubbing a hand over his neatly trimmed beard. I suppose we wait, but time is not our ally. If King Robb can't send a swift reply, I must make my move south. The Tyrells are growing impatient and the city is weakening by the day. My sources say supply lines into King's Landing are fraying and Cersei scrambles to appease the masses. If we strike soon, the city might open its gates. A siege might even be unnecessary. Arya snorted softly from where she stood. The Lannisters aren't that easy to topple. Renly arched an eyebrow, a hint of amusement touching his lips. Perhaps not. But we must try. Time is ever precious in war. Thus they remained at an impasse. Caitlin penned another raven to Harrenhal, begging for any word from Robb or Ned, but the only reply came from Willis Manderley, repeating that no messenger from Robb had arrived. Anxiety gnawed at her. Had Robb's host forced Tywin into some remote mountain pass? Had Ned found them, or was he lost in the chaos? She woke each day hoping for a rider or a raven, only to be disappointed. Meanwhile, she could not help noticing that while Renly projected confidence, there were signs of discord beneath the surface. Some of the Reach lords privately grumbled about the cost of prolonged encampment so far from home. Others fretted that Stannis might strike Storm's End in Renly's absence. And a handful openly worried that if the city was seized too easily, the Tyrells might not gain the influence they sought from crowning Renly. Politics, always politics. Arya took to practicing with some of the Tyrell knights in the training yard, drawing curious onlookers. Once, when she sparred with a certain Ser Rabar Royce, a knight sworn to Renly not to be confused with the Royces of the Vale, she surprised him with her ferocity, nearly tagging him on the flank. Ser Rabar praised her skill, comparing her to a water dancer from Bravos. Arya smirked at the compliment. Yet behind her grin, Caitlin saw the same restless longing to be part of the real fight, to find her brothers, to avenge the wrongs done to her family. During a quiet midday, Marjorie Tyrell invited Caitlin and Arya to join her for a meal in her private tent. It was a comfortable space adorned with flowers, silks, and subtle perfumes. Marjorie listened sympathetically as Caitlin recounted the hardships of war. The young Tyrell lady spoke with surprising pragmatism. When this war ends, we must ensure the small folk are not forgotten. Too often the lords settle their differences on the backs of peasants. Caitlin nodded. We in the North try to protect our small folk as best we can, though the distances are great. The Riverlands have suffered terribly with the mountains' raids and constant battles. I pray the worst is behind us. Marjorie's eyes flicked to Arya, who sat cross-legged, nibbling a pastry. Lady Arya, do you believe your father and brother will consider an alliance with Renly? Arya shrugged. I'm not a lady, she corrected automatically. But if Renly is sincere and doesn't try to force Robb to kneel, maybe. We only want to keep the North safe from Lannisters and anyone else who'd harm us. She stared pointedly at Marjorie. We've had enough of kings who break promises. Marjorie smiled gently. I understand your mistrust. I can only offer my word that Renly wishes to unify, not subjugate. We face a common enemy. Once that's settled, we can talk of boundaries and titles. Arya said nothing, but her expression was guarded. After a moment, Marjorie turned the conversation to lighter matters, her home in Highgarden, the beauty of its gardens, how she hoped one day Westeros might return to tournaments and festivals rather than constant warfare. Catelyn responded politely, though her mind remained anchored to the question, where were Ned and Robb, and what new storms might soon break? As if in answer, 2 mornings later, horns blared at the edge of Renly's encampment. A rider had arrived, wounded and drenched in sweat, bearing a Stark sigil. Word spread like wildfire, and soon Catelyn and Arya rushed to meet him. Renly, Loras, and Marjorie also appeared, eager for news of the war in the west. The rider's horse collapsed, half dead from exhaustion. Catelyn supported the man as he staggered into the nearest tent, eyes wide and unfocused. My lady, he rasped. I come from King Robb, from Lord Eddard. They Tywin. He choked, coughed, and nearly fainted from fatigue. Catelyn's heart pounded. Arya hovered close, face pale. Renly beckoned for a maester to assist. They managed to get the man water, loosen his armor. He gulped in air, gradually steadying. Speak, please, Catelyn urged, though fear twisted her insides. He swallowed painfully. Our host engaged Tywin near the crag, west of the Red Fork. It was a brutal fight, many dead on both sides. In the chaos, the Kingslayer led a cavalry charge. King Robb was wounded, an arrow in his side, but not mortal. He fights on. Lord Eddard also wounded in the same battle. Catelyn clutched his arm. Wounded? How badly? The man's head drooped. I don't know for certain, my lady. Rumors said he lost much blood. They retreated to the ruins of an old keep near the coast. Tywin's forces, regrouping. The Great John tries to rally our men, but we're scattered. A strangled noise escaped Arya's throat. Renly placed a steadying hand on Catelyn's shoulder, but she hardly noticed. Alive, though? Did you see him, or hear it firsthand? Yes, the messenger gasped. Alive last I knew, but they need reinforcements, more healers, supplies. Tywin's men hold the roads. We had to slip through side paths just to get here. Catelyn's mind reeled. Ned, grievously injured, Robb with an arrow wound. This was the nightmare she had feared since the day the war began. She forced herself to remain composed. You did well to bring us this news. Rest now. Renly knelt beside them. Lady Stark, it seems your son and husband need aid at once. My host is large, but also preparing to move on the capital. Even so, I cannot ignore this. If King Robb is forced to yield, Tywin might turn south with renewed strength. We must respond quickly. Catelyn's vision blurred. She took a trembling breath, forcing clarity. Yes, we must. If you help me reach them, bring some portion of your forces to relieve them, we could smash Tywin's hold on the roads. Renly glanced at Loras and Marjorie, who both looked grim. He rose smoothly. I can spare a significant detachment, commanded by capable lords. It might be enough to break Tywin's blockade. But the rest of my force must remain pointed at King's Landing. The time is ripe to strike at Joffrey. Tears threatened at the edges of Catelyn's eyes, but she held them back. She would not let her family die in some forsaken battlefield while she dithered in a camp. I'll lead you there, or at least ride with your detachment. Show me the fastest route. We can gather supplies along the way. Arya squared her shoulders. I'm coming too. Renly gave the girl a sympathetic look. That's a dangerous journey. Perhaps you should remain with my queen. No, Arya barked, hand gripping needle. My father and brother are there, wounded. I won't sit idle. Catelyn shot her daughter a look of mingled dread and understanding, then turned back to Renly. If you truly wish for an alliance with the North, help us now. Stand with us. Or at least send enough men to break Tywin's blockade and get the wounded to safety. Renly seemed resolved. I will do just that. Loras, gather 1,000 mounted knights. 2,000 if we can spare them, and enough foot to hold the roads. Ser Garland, you'll coordinate the supply wagons. Lord Mathis, see to the bridging equipment for any rivers. We march within a day. Chaos erupted in the pavilion as each lord sprang into action. Horns were sounded, and men rushed to pack up tents. The Tyrell camp mobilized with startling speed, eager for a chance to further weaken the Lannisters and prove Renly's might. Marjorie approached Catelyn, placing a comforting hand on her arm. You have my prayers for your family's recovery. If this plan succeeds, we may at last see a turning of the tide. Catelyn managed a tight, grateful nod. Her voice wavered. Thank you, my lady. Inside, her heart fluttered like a frightened bird. She had to hold to hope. Hope that Ned and Robb clung to life, that the North's battered forces could rally, and that this sudden alliance with Renly might shift the entire war's balance. In a swirl of preparations, the makeshift alliance prepared to ride west. Stark, Tully, Tyrell, Baratheon banners intertwined in a bizarre tapestry of necessity. Arya readied her mare, brow knit with determination. Catelyn could only cling to the possibility that they were not too late, that Tywin's cunning would not snuff out the lives of those she loved. The war spanned every corner of the realm, but in that moment, her entire world narrowed to one goal: saving her husband and her son from the jaws of death. And so they rode into the uncertain dawn, forging a final stand against the Lannister might that had long menaced them all, haunted by the knowledge that one miscalculation could spell doom for them, and for the dream of peace they still nurtured against all odds.